All right, welcome, welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute here. If you're joining us anywhere else or if you're watching a recording of this, uh, yeah, we'll get started in about a minute. All right, we got people coming on board. All right. Okay, so let's get started. Before we begin, I want to get ourselves settled for workshopping. So if you are watching this on Zoom or if you are watching this in the future, I'm going to give you a second to get ready. Uh, Make sure you're muted by default. Use reactions. Be prepared. So if you need to go get a notepad or you need to open up your notes app, go ahead and do that now. And leverage the chat. So if you have anything if you have anything that you're looking to talk about, if you have questions, if you have feelings, if you just like what you just heard, feel free to use the chat as a communications platform. So just to make sure that we can see everything, if you can see my screen and you're ready to go ahead and type 1 in the chat. All right. I'll give it another 30 seconds here. Again, if you're ready to go, type 1 in the chat. Okay. All right, fantastic. So you might be asking, what about questions? Right? And questions, I love questions. And so I'm happy to receive them from you. There are three ways that you're going to get your question answered today. One, we'll have a Q&A section at the end. Go ahead and raise your hand and we'll have a conversation. Second thing is the chat. If you put a question in the chat, I'll see it and either I'll answer it immediately or I'll wait to Q&A and we'll lead off with it. And the third thing is there is a feedback form at the end of this presentation. So if you want to ask me a question and you don't feel like asking it publicly, I am here to answer that. Just fill out the feedback form at the end and you will get a response to your question. If you're curious, the AB and slides and all of that will be made available. This is recorded, and you will be receiving the slides and the video after this. So no worries. Uh, you can just focus on the material and you can listen back if you need to later. So, our agenda, we're going to have a quick introduction. We'll talk about why your metrics don't work. We'll talk about racking your metrics. Then we'll have feedback and Q&A. And that is our agenda for our workshop today. With that table being set, let's get started. Why aren't your metrics useful? If you're here because either you want to learn more about metrics or your metrics aren't working, right? You provide a bunch of numbers and people aren't really getting into them. They're not engaging with them. And I'm here to tell you that the way you're using metrics is probably systemic. It's probably a systemic problem. And as W. Edward Deming says, a bad system will beat a good person every time. You mean well. You want the team to win. In fact, the rest of the team wants each other to win generally. We're not sabotaging each other. But if our system is bad, if we're not super clear about uh, what our numbers are, how they relate to the big problem, and how to communicate them, well, we're in the middle of a bad system. And so we'll lose. What are metrics? Metrics are a communication tool. That's it. If you're wondering where's the big definition with the tons of slides, we don't need them. Metrics are simply a communication tool. Communicating what? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. And why are we here to talk about it? Well, without metrics, without clarity, without a way of thinking about what success looks like, we have no idea if something is good or not. And believe it or not, this is the number one reason why startups fail. The number one reason why startups fail, the number one reason why problems end up, our big companies end up full of problems, is ironically because we are rarely targeting the right problem. And how do we know that we're getting closer to the right problem to solve? Well, our metrics should be communicating that. Remember, metrics are a communication tool. And at their best, metrics clarify the difference between failure and success in a way that inspires action. If your metrics aren't helping people act, they are dead. They are useless. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How to create metrics that inspire action. So, how do you know your metrics aren't clear? Well, number one, your metrics aren't inspiring action. If no one is referencing your metrics, they're probably not clear. If no one is using your metrics for decision making, they're probably not clear. If no one knows your metrics, they probably aren't clear. And one of the reasons why you may have metrics that are unclear is you may have too many. It's very easy for us to get lost in collecting numbers. Put a 2 in the chat if you work in an office that has a lot of dashboards with numbers you don't look at. Or there are dashboards, well, we're all digital now, right? Maybe there are dashboards that exist somewhere on your company intranet, or they may be hidden in a program, right? Right. And as these 2s roll in, right, you see this is a problem that people tend to have. They tend to have way too many numbers because they collect way too many numbers. And the reason why they collect too many numbers and show them off on dashboards is because it makes people feel good. But those numbers aren't inspiring action. It's because of something called Miller's Law. Now, Miller's Law is a principle by George A. Miller, and it's often summarized as the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. What it means is the average human can hold 7 things in their head at once, plus or minus 2. That's it. We can hold between 5 and 9 things in our head at once. Where is this displayed? Well, it's displayed a lot in the advertising world. If you listen to podcasts, one thing that you have heard are podcast commercials. Now, these podcast ads are generally 30-second spots where their goal is to get you to think about this idea, this company, this product as much as possible. And if you pay attention to the words, you'll realize that they are saying the name of the company or the product at least 7 times. Athletic Greens, 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 right? It's being said so that it gets stuck in your mind, right? Um, you're not thinking about anything else besides athletic greens in the next 30 seconds. Maybe that's enough for you to go look at the website or enough for you to go make a purchase. So your numbers can do the same, right? If you're giving people 50 numbers, they're not digesting any of it. Now, you may say, hey, I have no metrics. Go ahead and put a 3 in the chat if you have no metrics to share, right? No one has told you what's important. We usually get 1 or 2 of these. And if everybody has numbers, fantastic. If you are in a space and you're watching this later and you have no metrics to pull from, my recommendation to you is to pick one. Douglas Hubbard, in his book, How to Measure Anything, makes the point that some data is better than no data. And to reflect this, he was talking about a manager of a parking garage who was told that he needed to see if his if his parking lot was being taken care of. And qualitatively, meaning basically the story in his head or what he knew was that if the parking attendants are smiling, then the parking lot is cleaned up. And so he was wondering how to capture that. Well, Douglas Hubbard just said, count them, right? And something as simple as counting the smiles on people's faces correlated to how clean the parking garage was. And so now he has a number, he has a metric, he has a way of tracking and communicating. Right? And that's all that is. And so we want to go into our first piece of the workshop today. And so I'm going to ask you to do a couple things. I want you to think about the metrics that you're keeping track of at work. Ask yourself, what's the most important metric right now? And then I want you to write it in the chat. If you can, write why it's important. Bonus points if you could tell how many other metrics you're tracking outside of that important one. And if you have if there's maybe 2 or 3 things that may be important you can't really tell or you're not sure of, feel free to write 2 or 3 things. It's okay. But the idea is to start to get you to narrow down on what's important, what may be important to you. I'll give you 2 minutes. All right. So I'll give folks 10 seconds to their get their metrics in. So go ahead and hit that enter button. And so what I hope this exercise is helping you do as you're thinking through it is really just start to make some decisions. As you pick these metrics, think about what metrics you're picking, why you're picking them, uh, and how are they driving behavior. Because if you're able to clearly think about what's important, you'll have a great starting point for the next parts of this workshop. If not, through this workshop, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about a number. And I want you to, as we do these other exercises, I want you to try to apply it and see how far you get. So at the end of this section, two things I want you to know. Something that's fairly useful is to get a list of all your metrics. List them all somewhere. If you don't know which ones to pick, just list them all and then start asking yourself some questions. What is important, what isn't, and then try to pick one or two. And then don't forget Miller's Law. If you can have 7 plus or minus 2 things in people's heads. Lean towards the -2. Lean towards 5. Right? 5, 2, 7, and maybe 9. Right? Try to focus on getting as little as possible so that you can drive action. All right. So now that you have some metrics in mind, some folks have some metrics, maybe 1 or 2 metrics in mind. Maybe you have some that are in your head and you're thinking about using them for the rest of this. Let's talk about how to create metrics that inspire action. And so remember, metrics at their best clarify the difference between failure and success in a way that inspires action. They're clear. Well, let's talk about why metrics may be unclear. Well, there are 3 things that I think stop metrics from being clear to people to drive action. 1, they aren't prioritized. Do we know what's important? We sure. 2, they aren't urgent. Why are we using them now? Who cares, right? 3, they can't be translated. I am thinking about user engagement metrics, but how about the person in sales? Do they know what a user engagement metric is? Do they care? If you don't have a way to have that conversation with somebody else in a language that they understand, then those metrics are going to be unclear. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to learn some ways to turn metrics that overwhelm and don't create stakes and make sense to some but not all, to transform them into metrics that focus on the most important things, create a sense of urgency, and give you a way to change those metrics and adapt them to whoever is looking at them. This process is called racking your metrics. I call that because what you're doing is you're making your metrics relevant, you're making your metrics adaptable, and you're making your metrics quantifiable. So we're going to go through each of these and we're going to have an exercise that walks us through doing that with the number that you're thinking of right now. Let's start with relevancy. Metrics that are relevant, generally there are a couple of questions that you want to ask yourself to understand and determine the relevancy of a metric. You want to ask yourself, why are you measuring this? What's the why behind it? Why do we care? What are we trying to accomplish? And then how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we know that we're working on this metric? And so I use this format called push-pull action. And the push-pull action framework here is really a way for you to start thinking about your metrics and how relevant they are. What does it include? Well, first you have the push. The push is asking you, what is the problem that we are trying to solve here. So identify what is the problem? Why are we tracking this in the first place? For example, we have a high churn rate and we hypothesize that it could come from our customer service issues, right? That's the problem that we're trying to solve. If you can't tell me what the problem that you're trying to solve is through that metric and it doesn't do anything with it, it's probably noise. It's probably not relevant. Next is a goal, right? Is a pull. We pull towards something, right? Our work is helping us pull towards something, and that is our goal. And so you want to outline that goal, helps us, and that goal helps us understand if we're keeping ourselves on track. Metrics are a communication tool. So it's helping us get to somewhere. So what is it? What is the goal? What are we ultimately trying to do here? And much like a problem, if you can't tell me what the goal is, if that number does not assist with us getting to the goal, it's probably not relevant. And then action. How do we hold ourselves accountable? What are we doing with this so-called metric? Are we bringing it up or are we bringing it down? What is the work that we're doing in order to change that metric? How do we know if it's working? And so I want you to spend the next 5 minutes creating a push-pull metric. So take the metric that you had earlier and ask yourself the following questions. What is the problem that that metric is helping us solve for? What is the goal that that metric is helping us pull to? And what are the actions that we're going to do in order to move that metric in the way that we want to move it? This doesn't have to be comprehensive. Like the example that I'm showing you here on the slide is only a couple sentences. We want to get very high level here. But the point is to have you start to think about these things. And so I'm going to go on mute. You have 5 minutes. Have a blast. All right. So I'm back. I'll give you about 15 seconds to press the enter key if you're looking to clean up your answer. Uh, some good examples here in the chat. One thing I do want to push people on is when you think about the problem, think about why. Always ask yourself, why is this important? Why? Why is this a problem to us? Right? Moving a number for the sake of moving a number isn't really driving towards the why. It tells us what you're doing, but why, right? Why is super duper important because that why is going to be a compass for you for not just the rest of these exercises, but also as you think about bigger and bigger things that you're keeping track of, whether it's your objectives, right? When you start to think about your OKRs, well, now you have a starting place to think about those things. Or a strategy. How do you connect it to the broader company strategy? What the strategy numbers are? Well, you have a number that you can start to lean on to tell stories about the work that you're doing. All right. So let's talk about adaptable metrics. We started with relevant. Now we're doing adaptable. R, then the A. Uh, adaptable metrics let a team know what is changing. A lot of the things that drive us um, as human beings are we're focused on change. If a movie that you're watching is doing the same thing, whoops! If a movie you're watching is doing the same thing over and over and over again, you lose interest in it. If you're showing, if you're not telling people the change that is happening in your current work, um, then over and over again, you're going to find yourself uh, boring people, and they're not gonna engage with it. Next is you got to set stakes. Specify when the results need to be achieved. One problem I see a lot with metrics that people make is they don't tell people when they need to change or how they need to change or how soon they need to change. Setting stakes allows people to prioritize in their heads. Right? This example, I say we need to change the churn rate in the next 2 weeks. Right, that gives people a frame to start to prioritize what's important for their day to day. And then lastly, you want to connect it to strategy. I mentioned strategy earlier around the why when we were talking about our problem. I'm going to reiterate that we're trying to get somewhere, right? There's an overall big picture that your work is trying to push the team to. How do we make sure that is super clear to people? Well, we put that in our metric. How do we connect it to strategy? And just like in the last section, I'll give you a framework, I'll give you a format for you to do it. So the easy way of doing all of those things that I just mentioned is to tell people what the old state was and then what's the new state that you're looking for. You're going to give them a time period, and then you're going to tie your strategic goal, whatever is important to you, uh, important to the company over the long term, to it. So one of the mistakes that teams tend to make is they tend to not be verbose with the metrics. They tend to just put a number down. But if you put a little bit of a descriptor around it, literally a sentence or two with each metric, it gives people a way to guide themselves to the right moment, to the right uh, to get the right thing going. And so this is your next exercise. You're going to take the metric that you have and then you're going to adapt it. You're going to talk about the metric, you're going to talk about the current state, you're going to talk about the desired state, the deadline, and the strategic goal. And you're going to follow that template that I have here. You've got 5 minutes. Looking forward to what you create. All right, welcome back. A little excited. Um, so I'm gonna give you 30 seconds or so to drop that answer into the chat here. Fill out that template that you see. One of the things that I think is important about this exercise is you start to think about your metric in a current state, right? You start to think about your metric in a way that really talks about what's happening now. Remember, metrics are here to help us act. We're here to move. And so if we're not moving, if we're not really telling a story that allows people to get us to move, um, then we're dead, right? Our metrics don't really mean much, right? The idea is get moving, right? So let's go to the Q. We did R, relevant, A, adaptable, and now let's get to quantifiable with the Q. Remember, I said earlier, if you talk about, if you're talking about user engagement metrics, and you're going to go talk to sales, if you use user engagement metrics, they're not going to have any idea of what you're talking about, which is true, right? If they came back and started talking about sales metrics, would you have an idea what they're talking about? Probably not. You probably nod and it probably go in one ear and out the other. And so that's why it's important for us to have quantifiable metrics. We want to have our metrics that have some flexibility. Uh, we want to have metrics that connect back to the end goal, and we want to have metrics that help us find alignment. And so, metrics that help us do that are um, or a way for us to do that is to have leading and lagging indicators. Leading and lagging indicators are a way for you to essentially map out your metrics. So when you have a metric, each metric has a leading and lagging indicator, with the exception of two particular metrics, which I'll talk about in a second. Leading, meaning it's ahead of it on the map, and that is going to help identify future performance, right? Um, it's going to help you do proactive adjustments, and it's going to inform your tactics. Lagging, on the other side, is talking about past performance. You use it to understand what happened in the past. It's there for past outcomes and informed strategy. Both of these are useful. You shouldn't leave this presentation feeling like I need to focus on leading indicators or lagging indicators. You should leave this presentation saying, I want to focus on both. I need to figure out what the leading indicator for my metric is and what is the lagging indicator for my metric. And so, what are some examples? Let's say churn is the metric that we are looking at. A leading metric for churn is probably feature utilization, right? So, with your team, you use feature utilization to tell stories or to create stories or to, and by stories I mean, agile stories, or to generate action. But if you're sitting with your boss, if you're sitting with the founder of the company, they don't care about feature utilization. They may say they do, right? But generally what they care about is revenue, which is after churn, right? Churn affects revenue. Now, I mentioned earlier there are two lagging indicators that are special. Those lagging indicators are revenue and cost. Does anybody in the chat have an idea why it may be revenue or cost? I will give a second for someone to type that in. The reason why it is revenue or cost and why they're special is that every business transaction eventually leads to revenue or cost. They are mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive. You may know this as me seed, right? And sometimes for business majors, they'll talk about if the thing is me seed, which is again mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive, meaning that everything goes back to those two numbers. In business, everything goes back to revenue and cost. Therefore, nothing is lagging after revenue or cost. So I talked about, right, this is more or less a picture of what I just described, right? Churn, if you're leading, it's feature utilization. If you're lagging, it's revenue. Now, uh, you might see sales and CS here. What does that mean? What are these things meaning? Well, what they mean, or what that's trying to get across, is that sales has metrics that lead into churn too, and so does customer success. Now, your job as a product person, if you want to go tell the story, is to learn what they are. And then anytime you're thinking about churn, include them in your uh, presentation, include them in how you're describing your story, include them in a way that helps drive action. You can take those metrics and use them in the previous two sections to tell a story. And that's super duper important. Why is it important? Because you want people to understand you, right? If they can't translate the importance of the metric that you're trying to give to them, then they're not really going to listen to it. It's going to go in one ear and out the other. One more thing to think about. You should not, as a product person or design person, talk about revenue or cost. Why? Well, almost everybody affects revenue. How do you isolate it in a way that allows you to know if you're affecting it or not? You really can't. So it's important for you to start to go and find out what the leading indicators are to revenue, the things that you can affect, and use that as a way to talk about the work that you're doing. Super duper important for that, because if you just keep talking about revenue, then you're not going to be able to. Like, everybody is affected by revenue, right? You're affecting revenue by breathing, literally, in the company. And so I want you to draw a metric map, right? We're going to do this by text, but in the chat here, I want you to ask yourself a couple questions, right? The metric that you use for these exercises, ask what happens before the metric. There's an interaction. There's a thing that drives that metric, right? That's going to be your leading indicator. What happens after that metric? If it's late enough in the process, then it'll be revenue or cost. But maybe there's something else that happens before it. In this example, I have checkout, right? Maybe it's churn. And then who else can be affected by that number changing? And so I want you to write that in the chat. I want you to go through this thought exercise and build a metric map of at least three metrics. And if there are any gaps, highlight them, right? Ask yourself, why is this a gap? How can I get to know what's happening before or what's happening after, right? And that's something that you can take home with you after this workshop. Then I want you to say how other groups may be affected. See you in 5 minutes. All right. So we're here. Um, what this exercise is. Oh, wait. Here we go. I am not audio on, not video on. Now we're fixed. Okay, so what I'm hoping this exercise is helping you do is the two things. One, I hope it's helping you see the connections in the work that you're doing and how it affects everyone else. It might be worth taking some time and drawing this out. Um, the word "draw" is not a mistake. We can write it, but I think it's often more impactful to draw it. So after this session, you might want to go draw it and just see how far you can take it. I guarantee you this: it's going to make your conversations with other teams far more fruitful. because you're turning yourself from a pawn to a queen, right? To use the chess analogy, you were only going to go one way before. Now you're giving yourself the opportunity to go multiple ways. Now, you can figure out what metrics are important for you. You can write down those pushes and pulls. You can go figure out what the stakes are, and then following through a single transaction or sale, walk through how it happened and map it. All three of these things are useful for you to go ahead and try, um, so that you're able to communicate the action more clearly. Because metrics that are relevant, actionable, and quantifiable drive action, right? Clear metrics drive actions. Now, before we end, I want to leave you with another quote from Deming, right? Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And if you have too much data, then you're not giving yourself the opportunity to go sell what's important and why the work that you're doing is important. There's an opportunity for you to go out there and to tell a clear story that's going to help people make better decisions. And so, if you have your phone, I would love for you to use it to fill out this form that I'm going to present before we get to Q&A. If you do not have your phone, give me 1 second. I'm going to give you a link for you to fill out, and I would love to get your feedback. I want to make sure that I get your feedback here so I can make this presentation better and better. Okay. 1 second here. While I get this file, if you have any questions, now's a great time to start typing them in the chat to kind of get your thoughts together. One moment here. All right. Here we go. There's a link in the chat. Please fill out that form. I'll give you a couple minutes. All right. So questions. Any questions? If you have them, go ahead and raise your hand. If I'll give it a minute or so. Oh wait, geez, I wasn't on mute. Okay, questions. If you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll deal with them one by one. Well, if there are no questions, I want to thank you for joining me. If you'd like, feel free to email me, adam.thomas@hey.com, or find me on LinkedIn. I at Adam Thomas. More than happy to answer your questions or talk shop. It's been an honor uh, workshopping with you today, and I wish you a fantastic afternoon, morning, or evening. Bye now.